Hello there, welcome to this revision video about the early modern period on the topic of people's health. So just a reminder that every time period that we're looking at the key themes of impact of living conditions, response to epidemics and improving public health. And the key factors that drive change during these time periods for people's health are beliefs, attitudes and values, local and national government, science and technology, urbanisation and wealth and poverty. The early modern period spanned the time period from 1500 to the year 1750, so 250 years of history. We're starting off in the Tudor era and ending in what are known as the Georgian times. So there's quite a lot of political change during this time period. There's quite a lot of new scientific discoveries, but one of the key features is not all of those scientific discoveries really translate into better health for people. So although, for example, in this time period microscopes are discovered, we're not going to find out about the germ theory of disease until the industrial era and the work of Louis Pasteur in the 1860s. So let's find out a little bit more about what you need to know for early modern people's health. So the main topics on this, firstly, the cultural, social and economic changes during this time period are crucial for you to know about. The growth of towns is one of the key features. Changing living conditions during this time, sometimes known as lifestyles, housing, food, clean water and waste. A response to epidemic during this time is the outbreaks of plague, including national plague orders and local reactions, with a case study, in-depth study of the Great Plague of 1665. And then we're going to be looking at the impact of local and national government on public health, including measures to improve the urban environment, and a depth study on the government response to the gin craze, which took place into the late 17th and 18th century. So let's find out a little bit more. This is just a reminder of what the exam questions look like for people's health. So you've got question 1A, 1B and 1C. You've got your knowledge-based questions. You've got your writing a clear and organised summary question. Question 2, where you have to come up with your own second-order concepts. Question 3, a causation question. And then question 4 or 5, you have a choice in the exam. They give you a statement, give you a viewpoint in history. You have to say how far do you agree with that. Okay, key historical concepts you're going to come across in the early modern people's health. So you can pause this and just check that you understand these words. Check you know how to spell them as well. So alderman, bubonic plague, cesspits, colonies, contagion, dearth, dunghills, dysentery, guilds, influenza, middling sort, plague doctor, raker, rates, typhus, and water closet. The first flushing toilet was invented during this time period by John Harrington in 1596. All right then, so the key characteristics and features of early modern Britain. So farming and food during this time, you could still get pretty bad harvests. So most notably, there was some really bad harvests in the 1590s, between 1592 and 1594. People did die of starvation occasionally, but actually farming methods generally improved during this time period. The population of the country increased from 3 to 6 million. So more people could be fed. So what usually happened where there was a poor harvest, it led to high food prices. Sometimes the rich would hoard food to keep prices high. So it wasn't so much that people were starving during this time, but they might not be getting enough calories in order to keep them healthy. So people often died from other illnesses that were brought about as a result of hunger. Towns and trade, so towns grew in size. London became huge, largest city in Europe during this time period. Mines opened in the northeast and created coal for people's fires, so there's more trade going on. There's new products. This is the time period where European countries begin to colonize parts of America. We know, unfortunately, about the transatlantic slave trade. This brings new products over to Britain during this time period, such as sugar and tobacco, and other things that are seen as exotic during that time, like tomatoes and chilies and things like that. So they were being traded due to the expansion of the empire and the slave trade and the East India Company. Religion, the country was still Catholic in 1500 with rich monasteries. That all changes during this time. So we know that we have the English Reformation, we have the ending of the power of the Catholic Church. The monasteries get closed down in the 1530s. And by 1750, England or Britain is a Protestant country. The wealth of the church is taken by the government and the monasteries will close down. New scientific discoveries begin to be made. There's a time period is known as the Renaissance time period, so lots and lots of new scientific discoveries. Robert Hooke developed a powerful microscope in the 17th century. And Parliament was becoming more powerful, so Parliament was beginning to make new laws that would affect different aspects of people's lives, although we're not going to find out about huge changes that governments make until the time of the Industrial Revolution. So, key characteristics. This is an engraving of London by Claus Vischer in 1616, a very famous historical source. During the early modern times, there was increased urbanisation. London was becoming the largest and busiest city in Europe during this time. Population rose hugely, as you can see there. The Great Plague hit the city really, really hard, killing between 70,000 and 100,000 Londoners, with 1,000 people dying a day at the height of the Great Plague, which is absolutely massive. Plague during this time would come back every 20 or so years. There's great fear of the plague during this time period, and they really didn't fully understand how to treat the plague still in the early modern period. So there's quite a lot of continuity in terms of approaches to the plague during this time period as approaches to the Black Death that we had back in medieval times. The plague, however, is much more confined to towns and the big sort of city of London during this time period. So a frequent measure that the rich take when plague strikes is basically to go out to their country houses and sit tight there and escape the plague. So there's a bit of similarity difference there, a bit of diversity there in terms of that poor people are much more likely to be affected by these diseases. Lots of other diseases during this time, so things like influenza, for example, and dysentery and typhus, for example, are all diseases that are common in the early modern period as well. Lots of people can get infectious diseases and die relatively quickly. The average life expectancy in this time period is around about 41, so pretty low. So what are living conditions like in early modern times? Well, in terms of the diets for the rich, they eat large quantities of meat and fish. There's new food types from overseas trade and colonization, like chilies and peppers and tomatoes. We get coffee, we get sugar, for example. We get chocolate, although people are mainly drinking chocolate during this time. Wine and ale are drunk more than water. People drink an awful amount of alcohol during this time, but it's actually going to be healthier than drinking the water. Even if you're getting piped water into your home, it's not going to be as clean as the piped water that we get now. White bread, there's fruit and vegetables during this time that people are eating. There's a bit more of a fashion for the rich people to be eating more fruit and vegetables in the early modern times than they would have eaten in the medieval times. But the diet is very protein heavy, led to digestive problems. Some of the rich suffered a condition called gout, which can cause severe joint pain and can be caused by eating food which is too rich or too much meat. The diet for the poor is much more constant to what it had been like in medieval times. So very much bread is still the staple diet. Vegetables, pottage is still very much eaten by poorer people in the early modern times. There's the occasional opportunities to eat eggs, cheese, fish and meat, but that's rarer, and things like holy days, they might, for example, save up and have that kind of thing. Now, religious festival days like Christmas, for example, there was a tradition of the rich giving out food to the poor, so that was another method that the poorer people might have got access to eating better types of food, would be on those holidays, because the wealthy people would give that out, and sometimes that's known as giving alms to the poor, ALMS. So diets of poorer people are in some ways healthier because they're eating lots of vegetables, but their diet lacked vitamin C and iron because they weren't eating enough meat. There were periods of hunger and starvation due to the poor harvests. So there's a lot of similarity and difference for you to pick out there. Rich people had a much more varied diet than poorer people, not affected as much by the food shortages. In fact, richer people and entrepreneurs would often hoard food to make prices higher. And there was a series of terrible harvests in the 1590s, which we've talked about a bit already. Okay, so there's a picture here of Lord Cobham and his family in 1567, showing the sort of range of kind of exotic foods that were brought in from the Americas and exotic pets that they had as well. There was a religious custom in the early modern times still of eating fish on Fridays. that began in medieval times. Early modern people believed that what you ate affected your health. Some people believed eating fruit made you fart. Others thought that fruit caused the plague, so there's quite a lot of suspicion about fruit. Coffee becomes popular. By 1750, there are 500 coffee houses in London, and the increase in sugar in the diet led to bad teeth and obesity. Famously, Queen Elizabeth I had pretty bad teeth, and her teeth were all rotten and black by the end of her reign. So there's lots of health dangers in the early modern period. So meat sold at the market could rot very, very quickly. Animals, famously, people would try and hide bad meat or meat that had gone off within pies and surround it with like lots of other stuff in there to try and hide it. But that would obviously cause health problems. Animals roam the streets, their excrement spread bacteria. Streets are unpaved, so it could become very muddy. Animal waste would mix in with mud and rainwater. There are also a growth in lung diseases during this time period, caused by burning wood and coal in open fires. Houses had an open fire which created soot, dust and smoke, which people breathed in as they walked the streets. Accommodation is really crowded and damp, and that could lead to lung problems. Drafty accommodation, not particularly well built. Water supply in the early modern period. So in the towns, companies pipe water to houses, but that could be quite expensive. You could buy water from a water cellar. There's more kind of piped water coming in. So in 1609, Hugh Middleton built a new river, bringing spring water 38 miles from the countryside outside London to a reservoir in Islington, which supplied the homes of 30,000 people in the city. People paid 4 times a year to be connected to the water supply. So that's not massively different in a way to kind of how we get our water now. Less clean back then than it would be now, and less kind of water treatment available and that type of thing, but still an improvement on medieval times. For poor people, they would collect water from the free public water fountain called conduits, or they would buy water from a water cellar if they could afford to. In terms of keeping clean, if you were rich, you could keep clean. So your servants would wash your clothes for you. Bathtubs could be used. That was really, really difficult to get a bath because you'd have to heat up all the water on the fire, so it would take a long time to do. So you'd need like a lot of servants to help you to do that. Interesting enough, it was quite common for babies to have baths, and because they needed quite a small bathtub and not too much hot water to do that. So babies would be bathed fairly regularly, but adults not so much. Queen Elizabeth I was said to have had a bath every month, whether she needed it or not. And that phrase comes from the fact that people used to believe that water could sometimes give healing properties, and therefore people would sometimes take baths if they were ill. Soap was made from olive oil for use on the skin, but again, the olive oil was expensive. So in a nutshell, if you were rich, you could definitely keep clean, and you would have perfumes, for example, so that you would smell nice as well. If you were poor, you would bathe in a river. So if you had a trade, for example, like if you were involved in the tanning process, or if you were a dyer and you were getting mucky every day, then you would bathe in a river. You would just have a quick dip in the river, probably at the end of the day. They used brushes on their skin, which was known as dry washing. But obviously washing yourself in a dirty river is going to kind of clean you a little bit, but is not, going to be the most hygienic thing to do. So in summary, if you think about second order concept of similarity and difference, much easier for a rich person to stay clean than a poor person. A rich person could now benefit from clean and piped water, but a poor person couldn't. The piped water is nothing like our water today. Most people would still drink what was called small beer, which was a weak ale during this time. So it's pretty rare really to be drinking water during this time. The sort of brewing process would, they didn't know this at the time, but they would kill the germs. So dealing with waste in the early modern period, so in terms of household waste, there would be in towns, for example, scavengers or rakers, which would collect ash, food waste and sweepings from houses once or twice a week. One of the common features during this time period is to see dung hills outside towns. So that was kind of better. Not so much of a big problem in villages, where people would still have their middens in their garden, which is their rubbish pile in their gardens, for example. In terms of dealing with urine and excrement, the flushing toilet was invented in 1596, but that was very expensive because you'd need piped water in, you'd need drains to kind of like take the sewage away. So it only really became popular towards the middle of the 18th century, although some of the wealthiest in society, of course, would have had flushing toilets. Privies would be emptied into rivers if they were built nearby rivers. Quite often privies were placed over a river, so the waste could simply drop directly into the river. They were known as jakes. Most privies, however, emptied into a cesspit, which often overflowed, and it was expensive to have your cesspit emptied. So if you were poor, for example, you might try and do it yourself, or it would overflow, it would maybe leak into someone's neighbouring property, etc. So that would be very, very smelly and very unpleasant as well. So privies and cesspits would pollute rivers and wells. Piles of excrement could build up in gardens, yards and alleyways, and that would, of course, spread disease. So in terms of the plague, there were many outbreaks of plague in the years after 1348, particularly in towns like London, for example. Most terrible outbreak of the disease, and that was the epidemic. So that's the one that we'll really focus in on. So the Great Plague took place in London in 1665. It then moved a little bit out of the country. It wasn't massively widespread across the whole country, but it did, for example, very famously, the village of Eyam, E-Y-A-M, in Derbyshire, was affected by the plague, and then it never returned to England afterwards. So that's quite an interesting thing for us to think about. So we'll have a little look at approaches to the plague during this time now. One of the big things to be aware of is that in the early modern period, people very much lived in fear of the plague. So there were serious outbreaks of the plague between 1500 and 1667, with the plague outbreak of 1665 being absolutely terrifying. The plagues were frequent, symptoms were terrible, many people died, they didn't know what caused it, people still blamed miasma, people still talked about the theory of the four humours, people still saw it as a punishment from God. So there's a lot of continuity in attitudes to the plagues during this time. Now, one of the big changes in the early modern period is that we start to see government getting more actively involved. So remember in medieval times, the very famous order from King Edward III to the Mayor of London in 1349 to order their streets be cleaned up, and really not a lot else was done. There's more national responses to outbreaks of plague in the early modern period. So in 1518, for example, when the plague struck, this is the start of the rule of Henry VIII. He's been king for about 9 years by this stage. The rules were to isolate plague victims in their own houses and identify them. Straw was hung outside infected houses. Anyone leaving the house had to carry a white stick. Isolate people in what are called pest houses outside the city walls. The problem with this would have been effective, but the orders were not enforced. But we're starting to get governments dealing much more with people's health. 1578, there's plague orders. There's 17 orders made, including recording the spread of the disease, financial help for the sick, and burning of victims' clothing and bedding. Plague sufferers and the healthy who lived in the same house were quarantined for at least 6 weeks, so we're starting to see the method of isolation now. Special prayers, however, alongside that to ask for God's forgiveness. So that did have some limited effectiveness in 1578, although the healthy were isolated with the sick, and that was seen as being immoral at the time. So people were starting to make a connection between dirt and disease, and starting to make a connection between close contact and disease during this time period as well. 1604, the Plague Act increased financial help for the families of the sick. This is right at the end of the rule of Elizabeth I, this one. City and town watchmen could use harsh punishments to enforce the policy of isolation. Harsher punishments imposed if a victim left isolation. A plague victim who left their house and mingled with other people could be hanged. Punishments included death for those leaving isolation, reduced the spread of the disease as people stayed in isolation, but people still did not know that plague was spread by fleas and rats, so only limited effectiveness. Local government ideas were often more effective. So in Yarmouth, local authorities banned pigs, dogs and cats from infected streets. The village of Eyam quarantined itself in 1665 to stop the spread of the plague to nearby Sheffield, causing 75% of the population of Eyam dying, but the plague not spreading to Sheffield. Some towns like Cambridge only allowed strangers into the city if they had a certificate of health, and many towns produced what are called bills of mortality, which were detailed records of plague deaths. In terms of responses to the plague in London, there's a very famous source here from the Great Plague. You can see that sick people were kept in bed. The doctors and nurses carry white sticks, which is a sign for others to stay away. People shutting up houses, people leaving London to escape the plague, dead bodies being carried away, dead people lying on carts, dead bodies being buried, funeral processions, and then the picture shows people returning to London after the Great Plague. But lots of measures there which would have helped the response to the plague. Of course, individual people respond to the plague in different ways as well. So just like in the Middle Ages, people went to church to pray. Many people ran away or they stayed. There's a bit of diversity here between rich and poor, so only the rich could actually probably afford to leave an infected town. Most people had to stay and actually deal with the disease as best they could themselves. People did try to find cures, so there was lots of people that claimed to have invented a cure. The sort of very famous plague doctors, and we can see a picture there of a plague doctor, used sweet-smelling posies or flowers to fight against the miasma. Smoking tobacco became popular as people thought that smoking could prevent miasma and be good for your health. People avoided the sick, so it became a sensible option to avoid people who were contaminated. Unfortunately, there were some racist views during this time, and some people blamed the plague on immigrants from different countries. People did sometimes stick together as well, so people did not usually abandon their families during this time and might instead gather together and pray for their survival. All right, so what's the impact of the government on public health during this time? Well, firstly, in terms of improving the urban environment, local government officials ordered that towns should be cleaned up. People in York were told to clean the areas outside their houses and to not put waste for scavengers outside until after 7 p.m. There's a fine system in York for any households which threw human waste into the street at night, and quite rightly so. It's a horrible thing to do. People were encouraged to empty their cesspits as well. Now, plague outbreaks stopped after 1670. Towns were improved mainly for the rich. In London, water companies brought piped water into people's homes, which you've seen examples of already. Only rich people could afford that. From 1670 to 1750, local authorities tried to improve town centres. Large houses built for rich and streets lit with lamps. Streets began to be paved. There's again a big difference here. So in the poorer areas of towns, there was no real improvements that were made. So most of the improvements that local authorities brought in were in the richer areas of towns. Privies and cesspits and the health problems associated with them were still a feature of life during this time. So, problem of alcohol. Alcohol becomes a big problem and big public health concern. Bit of a strange one, as people have been drinking beer since medieval times. But anyway, rum and gin during this time, a lot more alcoholic strength than the beers that they were drinking during this time. So alcohol becomes a problem in the early modern period. Rum is a byproduct of the transatlantic slave trade, and it became popular in Britain. Sailors were given a daily ration known as a tot of rum. Porter's ales and Guinness were popular by the mid-18th century. These ales are darker and stronger than the traditional ale, and people drank large quantities of alcohol. Now, between 1720 and 1751, the gin craze was a serious issue. So the craze for gin began because it started off as a very cheap drink. So the advertising said, drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pence. So the advertising was kind of encouraging people to get absolutely drunk. Now, gin was a cheap buzz. It allowed the drinker to escape the harsh reality of their lives. It led to an increase in crime. It ruined families. It increased the death rate. Many women, as well as men, became addicted to gin. Some women drank whilst pregnant, which led to birth deformities. Gin became known as the, quote, mother's ruin. A very famous case was in 1734. A woman called Judith Dufour actually killed her 2-year-old daughter Mary so she could sell her clothes to buy gin. Absolutely horrendous case, and shows some of those kind of key harsh realities of people's life, of the impact of the gin craze. So the government took action on this and said that alehouses had to have a licence, which only had a limited effect as there were not many smaller alehouses which were not regulated. The Gin Act of 1729 introduced a £20 licence fee for sellers and a 5-shilling tax per gallon for producers. The 1729 Act, however, was impossible to enforce because of the number of small gin shops. The Gin Act of 1736 increased the licence fee to £50 and the producer's tax to 20 shillings. But the 1736 Act failed because of similar reasons. Rioting happened against the law. Many people began distilling gin in their own homes illegally. And then the Gin Act of 1751 imposed harsh punishments on anyone selling illegal gin. And the consumption of gin fell after that. And that actually worked really, really well. Although, as we'll find out, with industrial times, there was still a problem of alcohol during the Industrial Revolution. And there you can see a very famous cartoon produced about the shocking impact of the gin craze during this time. Okay, so thanks very much for listening. That was a GCSE History People's Health revision video on the early modern era. Thank you very much.